Hello and welcome to another episode of Art of Impact. During this episode, I had the chance to sit down with Sherjan Husainie. Sherjan did his undergrad at the University of Toronto, studying aerospace engineering. It's interesting because Sherjan described to me how his degree did not fully resonate with him as much as he thought it would, and this realization truly paved a new path for him. He went on to complete a master's at UCLA and pursue a career as an investment banker, serving as a VP at Morgan Stanley in California and Hong Kong. Sherjan went to found a startup in the HR industry that facilitates the recruitment process for several companies, and currently he runs a podcast called My Personal Mentor. I've also attached the link in the description if you guys wanted to check it out. And this podcast focuses on practical and extremely useful tips on internships and jobs spanning several industries, particularly investment banking. And this podcast is sort of a digitization of several workshops he has been leading for almost a decade now, focusing on similar topics. I learned a lot speaking to Sherjan, and his very realistic and very personal take on how to succeed in pursuing what you're interested in is quite refreshing. And I hope you guys enjoy this chat I had with him. So, hey, Sherjan, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Hey, man, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So I guess what I wanted to ask you first, so I know that you studied aerospace engineering at U of T in undergrad. Mm-hmm. And you came to U of T, and I was wondering about, your decision to, one, like study aerospace engineering, and two, to come to U of T. Like what sort of inspired you to study aerospace? I'm actually interested with that.
Yeah, so I come from an immigrant family. My parents were from Pakistan, and when you're coming from one of those families, your options are usually engineering or being a doctor or go to law. And I was, when I was in high school, I was kind of a nerdy kid, and you have this mindset that, hey, look, choose the toughest program because that's what ego forces you to do. And when I looked at what was available in Canada, the engineering science program at University of Toronto seemed like one of those unattainable places where people would go, and it would have the toughest and most challenging degree, and if you were already taking challenging courses in high school, it should relate to the same kind of difficulty level. Yeah. So I looked at a bunch of universities and chose University of Toronto predominantly only because it was in Toronto, right? It was close to where my parents lived. There was no other reason. And I wish, to be honest, looking back, I wish I had looked more broader, especially, looked at the U.S. Schools out there, because at that time I had the grades for it. But, given parental pressures and, family being close, you end up choosing something that's close enough. And on aerospace engineering, it was the same thing. It's like, okay, this is the toughest engineering that University of Toronto, offers, and anything less than that is going to be failure. So, and that was a stupid thought. So I would recommend anybody listening to this to not think like that. I made a mistake doing that.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, that's interesting that you said you wanted something really challenging, and anything below that is not really worth it. Because I feel like that's a pretty common mentality from high school. Like I had something similar as well. I wanted to really challenge myself academically in university, but then slowly I'm realizing that university and just the whole experience isn't necessarily about the academics.
Oh, 100%.
There are a lot of factors that go into that. So yeah, when did you realize that this challenge or aerospace engineering in general might not be what you wanted to do?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The first point I think you mentioned about academic versus practical, and I think in high school, most people aren't judged based on practicality. What you learn in high school is all about academics and the tougher courses you take, and if you do well in them, that kind of defines your path into a better university and better university programs. So that mindset in high school is okay, and you can pass through it. But when you get to college or university, let's just say in Canada, that mindset has to change, because majority of the universities, like for example, University of Toronto is a very academia focused university, and they're not training people to go into industry.
Mhm.
And the earlier you can realize that, and realize that, hey, look, what I'm learning is not going to be used ever in the career path that I'm passionate about. And I realized that I was taking these courses that were like fluid mechanics and wing simulation and all this like crazy stuff, and I was just like, man, like I'm never going to use this ever, right? And then the stuff
Yeah.
that I was more passionate about was more on the creative side, on the business side, entrepreneurship side. I had a startup back, and it was called Small Businesses back then, but I started this photography company in second year of college.
No way.
And I was just like, oh man, that's my passion. Like, why am I studying wing simulation at night and skipping classes to do photography at a prom halfway across Ontario? So that realization that, listen, like you're in the wrong program and you're not learning things that you can actually use. But having said that, even though I learned that or found, or I guess got that realization, I didn't end up like implementing it. I basically realized it, but then I just let it hide, because that's where ego comes in.
Yeah.
And ego is, oh, what will my friends say if I quit? What will my family say if I quit aerospace engineering? What would happen if all of these people found out? And that's that's the part which I think I would recommend people not to be forced because of, and would look inside to their own passions and see, hey, this is what you want to do, go do it. Because later on in my life, like let's say when I was in investment banking later on,
Yeah.
or working at Google, I look back at it and I was like, oh man, I wish I had like switched out of that thing early, not because I would have a higher GPA or whatever, but my biggest regret was, I would have learned something that I would have used,
Yeah.
right? And right now I have learned 99% of things related to aerospace that I've never used. Like literally, not only never used, I don't even know how to use them. And I have an interesting story on that later on that I can share.
Yeah, awesome, man. Like, yeah, I'd love to hear that. And yeah, like, do you think a lot of people like face this problem of, doing something or being enrolled in a program and for whatever reason,
Yeah.
not wanting to switch up because of maybe family
Yeah.
pressures or, stigma?
Oh, for sure. I think like I would say majority of people in college or in university or in careers are in the wrong place. I
Mm.
truly believe that. And it all comes down to two things, in my opinion. One is bad advice and bad mentorship. Like think about it, like from a high school perspective, your mentors are your career counselor. Now that person who's a career counselor in high school, he or she has not seen all careers, obviously.
Yeah.
Now, that's one person. And then they're in some high school where they have to deal with 400, 500 students. They're not going to be able to give individual career advice to
Yeah,
that.
it's a big weight on like the counselor's shoulders as well to,
Oh, for sure. And
yeah.
then they're like, and then they're, giving advice like, hey, yeah, you should try engineering if you love science. Like that's kind of the advice they give. And it's very like, subject matter advice. On the other hand is like parents, especially in Canada, if you think about it, there's a lot of immigrant families, and they come from backgrounds that are very specific, right? Like even for my family, when I said I'm becoming an investment banker, they didn't really know what that meant. And for them, it was kind of a downgrade from being an engineer, right?
Yeah.
So the advice you get, the coaching you get is one of the biggest reasons why people end up in the wrong avenues. The other part I would say is peer pressure.
Mhm.
When you look at your fellow classmates, either in high school who are going to undergrad or who are in undergrad going to a profession, what you realize is there's this herd mentality, right? So if the smartest kid in your high school class is going to this amazing engineering program, you'd be like, oh man, maybe I'm making a mistake by not getting into that program. I should also be going into that program. Similarly, in college or in university, when you look at the kid who is the coolest kid or the one with the highest GPA going to work at NASA or working at like Boeing, right? You're like, oh, or like getting that job at Goldman Sachs, for example. You're like, oh, I should also be getting that because he or she got that. So
Yeah.
people end up in situations in the second phase where they're like in roles or work environments that they're 100% not passionate about. They're just there because that's where the herd went, and that herd mentality is leading them. So I totally think this is a massive issue, and more coaching and more mentorship can hopefully fix it little by little.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I feel like, for especially young people, even for me, it's hard, especially in your first year of university or maybe your last years of high school. It's hard to sort of think long term like that.
Mm-hmm.
it's much easier to, go with or what you're comfortable or accustomed to, especially, when deciding what to study at university or what career path follow, at least at an early stage. So maybe that could be a reason as well.
Oh yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah, and so you spent the majority of your career working as an investment banker, and like I know a lot of people who are interested in investment banking who are my age, and I've heard a lot of reasons for why they're interested, but I'm wondering about what your reason was,
Yeah.
especially from like, pivoting from such a different field into investment banking.
Yeah. I think the first reason why I wanted to invest in banking was, it felt unattainable, right?
Okay.
It comes back to that whole concept. The cool kids were doing it, and being in that herd mentality, I wanted to get a piece of that action as well. And that's one reason, because if you think about an investment banker, when you think about it from an aspect of just visually what they look like, you see like some cool kids who wear nice suits and have nice shoes and
Yeah.
have money. And when you yourself are a broke student, in engineering, walking to Bain in the middle of winter, and you're like, oh man, I want that lifestyle. I want that lifestyle of this investment banker. Exactly, right? So that was one reason. I was like, oh, this sounds really interesting, and this is where the cool kids are going. I want to do that. The second piece was, we immigrated to Canada with $300. That was my family's net worth. And when I see investment bankers, it was kind of like my ticket to be like, okay, this could be something where we would make some wealth, and then my parents wouldn't have to, worry about money, and I wouldn't have to worry about money, and money would just become something like oxygen is to us. So those factors, just social economic factors, were, I would say, the big reasons initially why I wanted to pursue, right? It wasn't the real reasons why you should pursue it. So, but then when I got into investment banking and went through it many, many years, and now look back at it, I think the better reason for someone to go into investment banking is not that it's unattainable or any of that stuff. I think it's the learning experience. It's kind of like a boot camp, right? You get in, you do 2 years at a minimum, and you learn so much. You learn everything about business and Excel and how to build beautiful business, models and financial analysis. And you just come out of that whole boot camp of sorts so well trained for the world of business that you're better than most people. Like in terms of you, for example, just your interaction with a keyboard and working in an Excel model, you just learn so much just about that one concept that you don't need a mouse anymore, right? And things like that just change the way you interact with some of the financial tools and how you think about businesses and analysis, and then all the qualitative stuff. Learning how to be in a meeting, learning how to do a proper handshake, learning how to wear a suit in a nice way. So all of these things, and getting that confidence is, it trains you into a better person and a better human, and just a more skilled individual in society. And I think that's the right reason to go into investment banking versus the reason I went into it for.
That's really cool. And yeah, because these days I feel like there are a lot of wrong reasons to go into jobs, especially investment banking. And it's a grueling, like from what I know, it's a grueling process to even recruit for investment banking and do it. But you think like those 2 years were initially where you're sort of working long hours, working really hard. Do you think they're worth it in terms of providing you with that learning experience?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I say they are worth it, but at the same time, there are newer avenues now that I think are also equally worth it. So, for example, if you want to go to investment banking is one of the avenues. It should not be the only avenue, right? Because if you're chasing, let's just say, a great career, awesome learning opportunity, building a brand around yourself, for example, and potentially a wealth, path. Let's just say you want to, accumulate wealth, in the short or the long run. Let's just say on the long run, if that's the right strategy.
Yeah.
Investment banking was usually historically one of the only paths, right? The other one was consulting, right? And sometimes accounting. But now there's a lot of other paths, especially in tech. Right. And I just want to kind of explain these two a little bit separately. So if you go the investment banking route, right? Okay, great. You get some wealth early on, more than someone else who's in a different field. You get an amazing learning opportunity with a very specific skill set. Like I said, learning Excel, PowerPoint, Office, and the business world. And you become a really awesome professional in terms of being in meetings and working with clients and just learning the whole, you know, toolkit of being a business professional. Now, the cost of that is you have to work long hours. You know, your attention to detail becomes really amazing. You kind of give a personal and social life, and all those things are the cost to it. So that's the path of investment banking. Now, similarly, if let's just say you are a junior PM, a product manager at a startup or at Google or something like that, right? Those paths may not pay you as much cash salary. Now, when I say not as much cash salary, I mean like, you know, minus 10 to 20%. It's not like you're losing a lot, right? Because again, you're in the early parts of your career.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but you're learning so much with multiple, like, for example, you're like, you know, working with multiple teams, you're, you know, managing processes, you are, you know, working in a high paced environment. And you're also getting, in terms of the wealth piece, you're getting equity, right? Even at a big company like Google, you're getting stock in a company like Google, which has high potential of growth, even though it's not a startup anymore. Yeah. So in the first couple of years, yes, you may be making less monthly cash, but your overall net worth isn't like, you know, far behind someone who is an investment banker. But the benefit is you have a lot more free hours in your life, right? So the money you're making, you most likely can also spend, right? You are more, you know, you're less stressed. You have less like, you know, impact on your health. So I think like, you know, both of those options exist. But if you are really determined to become an amazing business professional, highly recommend you go the investment banking route and just do it for 2 years. But if you don't care about being purely a business professional and you want to be a jack of all trades and learn a bunch of things and have a great life, and actually, in my opinion, have a better outcome in terms of wealth potential, go towards the startup and tech side things.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. And do you feel like people in general, especially in high school, will start to sort of receive advice like this?
I think the industry will turn. I think one of the things I think is in terms of compensation, because one of the biggest attractive points investment banks love to sell is the compensation, right? They don't directly say it, but they kind of say you can make the most money and blah, blah, blah. Now, the truth is, yes, investment banks are paying a lot of cash money early on, like to analysts, summer analysts, associates. But the truth is, you know, what is the ultimate thing that investment banker is doing in an early part of their career? They're not doing something that's too complex, right? As an investment banker, when you're junior, you're aligning logos, you're checking fonts, you're making PowerPoint slides, Word documents, and Excel models. Like, this is not rocket science, right? This is, you know, you learn it over a month, and then you repeat it and you just get good at those things.
Yeah.
Whereas on the other side, if you look at, let's just say, an assistant product manager at one of the startups, let's just say a junior product manager, that person's working with the engineering team, marketing team, legal team, launch team, making sure, you know, the bugs are out of the system. They're aligning everybody in play. They're working with a senior management team to make sure the project is on track. They're making sure the project doesn't die. They're making sure the project launches with success rates. And then they're making sure the project remains alive and gets to profitability. So if you look at two kids who are 23 or 24 years old, and one is an investment banker getting paid, let's say, $100,000, the other is a product manager at Google getting paid, let's say, $90,000, I guarantee you that the product manager at Google is learning a lot more and has a much bigger impact on society in general than the guy who's an investment banker and is aligning logos. So just based on that fact, I think what's going to happen in the next 5 years, and it's been happening for the last 10 years, I would say, the salaries that you see from these investment banking opportunities are going to lower and lower.
Really?
Yeah, and the salaries that are in the other side in the growth fields of tech are going to go higher and higher. The full compensation is going to go higher and higher, and also the opportunities that are available. There's a lot more startups that are starting than investment banks that are opening.
100%, right? Yeah.
So I think those opportunities will rise, and at some point, maybe not today, but maybe 5 years from now, someone who is entering the market is not going to be persuaded just because it says you're going to make 100K and welcome to Goldman Sachs. You know, they'll have 5 to 10 types of those opportunities. And then they'll just be like, you know what, there's no reason for me to go work 18 hours of the day aligning logos when I can do something else.
Yeah, that's really that makes you think, because part of investment banking, or at least recruiting people or talent, is a big part of the selling point is, really good compensation. Although you work really long hours, you get compensated pretty nicely. So
Yeah.
like it's going to be interesting to see how they shift their sort of recruitment process or how they look for talent when
Oh yeah.
that adjusts, in sort of a downwards trend.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and I know you did your MBA or you went to business. Oh no, sorry, you did your master's
Yeah.
in LA at UCLA.
Yeah.
So, like, first thing I want to ask about that is how was the experience of moving to LA and living there
Yeah.
for all? Because I've never been somewhere like I always see that
Yeah.
I envision myself, going there in the future. It looks like
Yeah. So look, I think living in LA, LA is one of the best cities to live in. In a heartbeat would move there in the near future, hopefully. I think LA is a great place. I think moving there was a little bit daunting for me. When I was in senior year of college, didn't get my return offer from Accenture after the summer intern. So I did a summer internship at Accenture in my junior and senior year.
Cool.
And I was the only intern to not get a return offer. But having said that, I was pretty devastated. I was like, oh man, this, sucks. What am I going to do? But then, my only option was there, this was the downturn of the economy and I wasn't going to be able to get into my dream jobs. And I didn't have any other offer. So the only path that seemed viable was to go to, some sort of business school right after undergrad and hopefully give it another shot, right? Like, learn how to get into investment banking, improve my GPA and everything else that, comes in the middle. So I got rejected by like 5 business schools. And the only business school that accepted me, put me on the wait list was UCLA. So when I got on the wait list, I was like, oh dude, this is the ticket to the ballpark. And then I basically like hustled and reached out to them and I said, look, would love to get in and follow my passion and my dream. And luckily I got in. So that was like the biggest thing. And I remember being a dumbass that I am, like the last few months that I was in Toronto when I got in, I would wear I bought like a couple of UCLA shirts from LA and I would wear them around, like a douchebag. And then I was just like walk around acting all cool as if like someone special, but that was just so stupid. But having said that, I remember I moved to LA on December 29th, 2009. And I spent New Year's Eve alone the first, because it was like, I didn't know anybody in LA.
Yeah.
And then the program started on, I think, January 3rd or something like that. And it was beautiful because like sunny California, beautiful people, beaches and all that. But the experience was different from what I expected. And as a business school student, when I was 22 when I got there. And as a business school student, you are, you're not in the same like undergrad mentality, right? And if you're 22 or 23, you are surrounded by 29, 30-year-olds who all are either in relationships or are married or have kids. Yeah. So you as a young guy are too volatile for them. And you end up like trying to have fun, but you can't have fun because they don't want to have fun. And then if you go to undergrad parties to have fun, undergrad parties are like, nah, dude, you're too old for this shit. And then, so you don't fit into any place. So my first year in college was, or it was a 1-year program, but that, program wasn't what I had expected in terms of social life. The other part that was annoying was, then I got hired, got my first investment banking job. I worked there for like 6-7 months. I never got the chance to experience LA as an adult. Because when I was a student, I was a broke student, didn't have money and no social circle. But then when I was an investment banker, I was so busy with work that I didn't have a chance to enjoy the LA life. So now when I'm like older and I go back to LA almost like once or twice a year, it's a lot different. It's like, it's one of those cities where I think you can have a lot of fun, live a great life. And there's a lot of new industries that are popping up. There's great jobs that are coming up because Snapchat's there, and a lot of the Snapchat mafia is opening new startups around the neighborhood. And even like the Uber's founder Travis Kalanick's new startup is in LA as well. So LA is a great place. If I get an opportunity in the future, I will definitely move there. It's one of my goals.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely want to visit sometime soon. But do you like it more than Toronto overall?
Yeah, so so Toronto and I have an interesting love-hate relationship. I left Toronto in 2009, which is pre-Drake, right? So this was before Toronto was cool. This is when the buildings in Toronto were brown and TDC sucked, and there was no Presto.
It sucks.
It's funny. It's like you say that, I left Toronto in '09 and I got back to Toronto literally last year, like end of last year. So I've been away from Toronto for 10 years, and the city has changed so drastically. It's a beautiful city now. It has amazing food and restaurants and social life, nightlife options. It has, in my opinion, an amazing transit system. And people who live here don't see that, but when you come back after 10 years, you see the difference between that TTC and
Really?
today's TTC. And it's amazing. I think like the Presto card stuff is great. The Union Station looks beautiful.
Yeah, Union's great, honestly.
Right, Union looks great. I think the buildings have, the architecture is world class. Then the sports teams are world class, right? Raptors have done well. I'm only a Leafs fan, right? Because I spend my basketball days in the Bay Area, so I'm a Warriors fan, unfortunately.
Oh, no way! Wow.
and I feel like a traitor when I'm like hanging out with my buddies here in Toronto who are like, dude, you got to be a Raps fan. But,
yeah, it was really intense during the playoffs. Like if you,
it was
Warriors
intense,
fan.
and my cousins were giving me shit. But look, I think Toronto deserves it, and I think the best part is the fans, dude. Like what Toronto has done with their fans and building that whole Jurassic Park, whatever it's called, is crazy. So yeah, so I'm a big believer in Toronto now than I was 10 years ago. And I'm much more open to working in Toronto and living downtown and seeing the options that exist for a career than I was back in the day. Because back in the day, the only option that was sexy enough for kids graduating was go work on Bay Street, right? Either you're at RBC or you're at Deloitte or one of the banks in the middle. Now there's a ton of other options, and there's cool companies, cool startups, and big companies like Shopify, Amazon, Google, all like everything in the middle. And it's a great lifestyle living down. So I'm a much more pro Torontonian now than I was 10 years ago.
Yeah, I feel like you're 100% right. I really like living here. I feel like, I don't know, for me, a big part of like whether or not I like a city is like, can I just go outside of my house and like do whatever, like walk around. Like I can pretty much walk like the whole of downtown, like within an hour or something.
Yeah.
And that's something I really like about Toronto, honestly. Yeah. So I know that, you became a VP at Morgan Stanley. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I'm wondering, something that I was curious about is, when you reach that level, obviously like security in terms of your career or, the future of your career isn't really a concern anymore. You're sort of set, like whether or not you want to stay in that field or pivot to somewhere else. But I'm wondering like what struggles or like what concerns in your mind start to creep in when you're in that position?
It's a great question, man. I think, so I got promoted in February of that year. And, being VP, it sounds so unattainable when you're like back in the day when you're an analyst or couldn't even get into investment banking, let alone Morgan Stanley.
Yeah.
And I became VP and I was just like, oh, here we go. And I've achieved it. And in the world of banking, when you become a vice president or older or higher rank, you are it's considered being an officer. So when you're an officer, you start getting paid, in company stock as well. So there's like a lot of things that happen and you have a much bigger team underneath you and blah, blah, blah. But for me, one of the things that I realized was, there's a honeymoon period when that happens. You get like, an office and you get your own little, like, you have a bunch of more people underneath you and things just start like, lining up easier than they were before.
Yeah.
And you're not pulling in the long hours. Like my hours were amazing. I was working like from 10 a.m. till 5 p.m. Right. Which is great, awesome. Which is better than most places. And but then what happens is you realize after, 4 or 5 months of that role, especially in these large corporates, you realize that, hey, what is actually changing? Is it just that I'm earning more money in the bank account and wearing a nicer suit every day? But is there anything else other than that is changing in terms of, is there any change in my way of living? Right. And truth is there isn't. Like, it's not like, if you're making, let's say if you're making $10,000 a month versus $20,000 a month, it's not like you're automatically now eating at some really amazing restaurant, right? It's like, it's not like you go from driving a Lamborghini to a diamond encrusted Lamborghini. Like, what I mean? Like, even though I don't drive a Lamborghini or anything like that, my point is like, after a certain amount of money, like everything else is BS.
Okay.
right? So, because like you can still afford a great gym, you can afford, eating out whenever you want, and after like when you make 10K or more in a monthly basis, like you can do most things. Okay, like yeah, you can't do some of the rare things, but you can still do them. Like if I want to go on a $10,000 vacation, I can. But just because I make 20K doesn't mean that's why I'm going. It's just like so you realize that on the aspect of life and upgrades in life, it's very micro, right? It's not a big change in lifestyle. The second thing is what you realize is you actually start realizing that your passion, right? What are you passionate about? Because you're at that stage where you're about to turn 30, right? So you've done the early part of your career, about to turn 30, and you're like, okay, I'm still young, I'm still single, I don't have a mortgage, or I don't have all these like things that hold me down. Do I want to spend the next 10 years, right, doing this job, right? And this job means learning this, doing this, and on a daily basis working this role. And when you realize that, you're like, okay, it's a 10-year bet. You got to make a 10-year bet, because if, remember, like I said, you start getting paid in stock. So you need to be like, okay, if I'm getting paid in stock 50% of my cash compensation, then I got to stay here for at least 10 years for that thing to kind of vest and be meaningful.
Yeah.
And what company is it? This is not a high growth tech company. This is a bank, right? Like maximum in 10 years, the bank stock will double, if that, right?
Yeah.
Versus you can go, learn somewhere else, build something yourself, whatever you want to do. So those things basically became a factor where I was just like, I was like, what, I'm happy in terms of compensation, all those things, but I'm very unhappy in terms of the work that I'm doing and how passionate I am. I'm not waking up excited, right? So for me, I was like, what, I've saved up enough money that let's go build something myself, and let's take a big risk. And yeah, the risk you're also taking is like, very rarely will you ever be invited back into investment banking. It's a very linear path in these places. But I'm not worried about that piece. I'm more worried about, if I'm 40 and I'm too old then to start something, then there's no return, right? Then you've already have too much commitments, and you've lost your shot of starting something yourself or joining something that's risky or young.
Yeah, that's pretty like that's pretty honest like take on it, because what you're talking about, it seems like one of those things that you'll never truly understand it until you're in that position, because like from a student's perspective or someone who really wants to get into investment banking, it seems like the ultimate goal. It's everything that they've wanted. They're going to be paid well, they're going to have meet a lot of people. It seems like the typical role like of the investment banker that they envisioned. But yeah, when what you're saying, when you get there, it's different than that. It's not exactly
dude, yeah, it's like we only hear the the flashy, sexy side of things for every story. Even like investment banking gets a little bad rep, but like you take any industry from banking to engineering to like for example, I'll give you a bad rep for engineering that I had when I was choosing engineering. I was like, oh, aerospace, I'm gonna build planes, I'm gonna build robots, I'm gonna do all this cool things that like MacGyver would do or whatever, like back in the day. But when you actually get in and you sit in class, you're studying like fluid mechanics and like really boring, theoretical things, and the practical stuff doesn't exist. So same with roles. Like you're like, oh, I want to, I want to go work at Boeing because I'm going to work on, the next 787. No, you're not. Oh, I'm going to go work at NASA because I'm going to work on the next Mars rover. No, most of the work isn't Mars rover. Most of the work is like, sitting in a cubicle, analyzing data on some sort of like, infrared rays that are coming into some telescope. So point is like, reality is, the image we get from what we hear about from marketing channels and places like that and other people, you don't get the truth, right? And I think once, the only person who knows the truth is, there's a famous saying, the man in the arena, right? Only that person knows what's it like to be in the arena and face the music, face the noise, face the battles. And only that person can make that decision. And everything else is fluff.
Yeah, it's a pretty good quote, actually. Yeah,
I remember. I forget who said it, but if you search it up, "Man in the Arena," there's a whole line on it that I think is really, really, really interesting to know.
That's cool. That's pretty cool. And yeah, so like on the topic of following your passion, realizing is this what I want to do for the next 10 years or however long it is. I know that your first startup that you sort of ventured on was Employ. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And it's like from what I understood, it's meant to change and like cater to changing needs in terms of how recruitment works.
Yeah.
Like before you talk about that, I want to ask you about recruitment in general.
Yeah.
And how do you think, that's going to change, and how the traditional ways of recruitment are going to change, like with cover letters, for example,
Yeah.
or in general, how talent is sought out. I'm wondering how do you think that's going
Yeah.
to change, like in near future, at least?
Yeah, I think I think some industries will change slower than others, right? And so the world that is like, legacy professional industries like law, accounting, banking, consulting, they will have a slower change because they're just older industries.
Yeah.
I think younger industries like tech are going to change faster. Things that I think are going to become obsolete are, I think, cover letter, I don't even think is a thing anymore. I think it's going to go away. I think GPAs will evolve. I don't think they'll become obsolete, but I think they'll evolve. And this whole concept of education and people going to 4 years of college, learning something that they don't know, I think this whole education system is going to have a much larger impact in the next 10 years, where some newer stuff is going to come out, where, for example, like someone who's graduating from a program will be ready to hit the ground running. So I think a university like U of T will over time evolve into someone like Waterloo or Ivy.
Okay.
Right. I think those universities not only teach you this, the academic knowledge, but they also teach you the actual, skill to do the job. That's why when you look at employers, they prefer a Waterloo or Ivy kid over a U of T kid, because the Waterloo and Ivy kid can come and hit the ground running. All right. Yeah. And so that's what. Now, in terms of recruiting, I think, recruiting is just a tough, it's such a broad space. I think it's going to become more efficient, but based on networking and building those bonds with employers early on, versus like this, crapshoot recruiting that happens now, where everybody submits resumes in a week and then quickly rounds of interviews happen and employers make a decision. I think what's going to happen is it's going to trend more towards, students getting more access to different employers and industries early on, like freshman year, and start seeing what they love, what they don't like, and which employers like which students and whatnot.
Yeah.
And the recruiting process is going to become more of an organic relationship building process. So by the time you graduate college, you are someone who is a highly sought after talent, and employers will then be reaching out to you to come join their company. So I think there's going to be a play, but this is such a broad topic. I can go in any channel to kind of dig deeper into this.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel like this change that you're talking about also gives students more closure in terms of what they like, what they don't like, and whether or not a recruiter or like an employer likes them or not. Because like nowadays, like a big part of the reality is that a lot of students, even like when I'm applying to jobs or internships, you just don't get replies more often than not. So and I'm wondering, so what was Employ doing specifically?
So with Employ, the idea was, when you think about recruiting, especially for industries like retail, services, hospitality, resume is less relevant, because you don't really care about all the skill a person has, because you're, entertaining customers or making food or, providing some hospitality service. What matters is your personality and your interaction with the customer. Yeah. And a lot of the folks that do these jobs are younger talents. They're Gen Z right now coming into the industry, and that's one of the largest segment that's entering into the market. So for employers such as, let's just say, Lululemon or Banana Republic, who's hiring this young talent, they don't need to see resumes. What will be helpful for them is to see a video-based response for someone who is high intent. And what Employ basically provided was kind of like a Snapchat for jobs. So candidates can apply using video. Managers can then quickly connect with them, interact with them, chat with them, and then invite them for an interview right on the app, and then hire them. So that's what we had built.
Awesome. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Especially with the service jobs that you were talking about. You sort of need to convey like a personality, and it's like, I can imagine it's hard to do that using a resume or like
very hard
traditional recruitment process. And have you found that people are using this app, using this like platform, and benefiting from it?
Yeah. So initially, so we were in business for 2.5 years. So we shut down in December. Okay. Initially we had a lot of good usage, but it was not real usage, right? It was it felt like fake usage. So what I mean by that is you would get all these employers who would say they're excited, they would sign up on the platform, they would use it, but then they wouldn't actually use it for what we had designed it for. And over time, that usage rate was dropping faster. So that's a clear signal that it's a lack of product market fit, right?
Okay.
Like you can have a great product and you can have a great market, but like, and your product makes a lot of sense and works beautifully and all that stuff. But the ultimate test is, how does the usage like turn out? And what you would notice is that, the product market fit wasn't there because the usage wasn't there. And employers, wasn't that they're not happy with the use case. They were just like, what, this is such a high velocity industry that they would go back to their old ways of like, oh, hey, I'm just going to hire my, cousin's son, or the guy who's the local guy across the street, or whatever it is. And we don't need to add all this process in place.
Yeah, that's a cool reflection. And do you think you're still interested in startups or ventures in this recruitment space? Do you think like there's still like a low supply there in terms of
I think
innovations?
Yeah, look, I think the space is ripe for disruption. I think someone should come up with a better version of what we built. I think the challenges are in the HR space is that it's a dinosaur industry. Most people in HR are a lot older than us. They don't want to change it. They are still tied to resumes, and the way things are done is the way things are done. And the issue with that is you're building an enterprise software solution. You need to kind of convince them to buy it. And that sales process can take 6 to 8 months. And as a startup, you just don't have time like that where you can spend 8 months getting a sales done, unless you have a lot of money, right? So I think there's going to be disruption in this space in a lot of different ways, from verification of talent to accumulation of talent to interviewing talent. Like the whole HR spectrum is massive. So I am interested to see what happens. Now, for me, I'm not passionate about HR space anymore, given I've done it once and I feel like it's not what I want to do. But what I am passionate about, continue to be, is my workshops and my podcasts and just helping students online. And that's a lot more scalable. And it's much more easier for me to do because I can do it through webcam and on a webinar on Zoom.
Yeah. And now I was going to ask you about the podcast you recently started.
Yeah.
How's that been? Like, has it been fun? Like,
it's been fun. Yeah. So I've been teaching these workshops for 10 years now, and they were all offline. And I remember, back in the day, my students would be like, hey, it would be nice if you can do it online. And I wouldn't I was stupid and I didn't listen to them. I wish I had listened to them and had taken this online 10 years ago. But I think the whole idea is, it's called My Personal Mentor. You can find it on different podcast channels and whatnot. The idea is simple. Like, I have a lot of content that I have accumulated personally over the years. And it's two parts. One is content, which is related to, tackling life, careers, just understanding the challenges and how to basically become a better interviewer and a better, skilled professional, and giving people hope of, that you can do it too. And hope is one thing, but also like the actual tactical skills that, hey, you need to do X, Y, Z to get there. And, if I can do it with a 3.0 GPA from a non-target background and get into companies like Morgan Stanley and Google, I am sure there's at least one other person who can do it, right? So at a minimum. And I think there's millions more. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is unleashing stories of, the same way how you guys are doing, but unleashing stories of young professionals who have done it recently versus who have done it over a long period of time. So on our podcast, we're not going to invite someone who's a managing director at RBC. It's not relevant, right? But what would be relevant is someone who's a 24, 25-year-old who's done it recently, and the steps he or she has taken recently, and that's more relevant to students and young audience.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, and then the last piece is just teaching these webinars, right? So I teach webinars on a weekend, every other weekend or every month, and students can join in and learn and learn some of the skills that I teach.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I've been listening to your podcast, and one thing I really like about it is, like what you're saying, it's not only like inspiring stories or whatever, it's more, there's a lot of practical advice there. And I feel like, more often than not, what resonates with people is, stories and practical advice. And I feel like it combines those really well. And it's pretty like straight to the point, concise.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the hope. Yeah. So it's been good. We're, 30 episodes in, I bang out one episode a day, and the goal is to get to, 100, then 1,000, and then 10,000. one day at a time.
Awesome. Yeah, and sort of like usually the last question we ask our guests before we wrap up the episode is, like looking back at your first year self in university, what would your one piece or what would your advice be to your first year self? Looking back at all these years, going straight fresh into university.
Yeah. My advice to anybody would be, the same advice. If let's just say you're an alien and you come to planet Earth and you walk into a, Baskin Robbins store, right? And you see 50 flavors of ice cream in front of you and you don't know what this thing is at all. And what I would recommend to everyone listening is try each flavor, right? Take a little, stick and try everything and see which one you like. Cause you never know. Like all the things that we think that we love are based on things based on assumptions by mentors that are not as skilled or experienced, or parents who come from different industries or different geographies, or friends who, have different passions and taste buds than you. So you need to figure out your flavor that you love, right? And pursue that. So when you're in college, early days of your life, this is your opportunity. Try as many things as possible and go deep. And you'll realize by the time you're 5 years out of college or 10 years out, you would have, perfectly sharpened your taste buds, what you are good at and what you're passionate about. And then when you double down on that, that's when success comes.
Awesome. Yeah, I really like the ice cream analogy as well. It makes it relatable,
Makes it relatable and tasty. I just want to say the full quote that was the man in the arena. I think it'll be helpful for your listeners. So it's a quote by Theodore Roosevelt. Okay. So the quote says, the man in the arena, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who never or neither know victory nor defeat."
Awesome.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Wow, well said.
Yeah, by much greater men than we, but yeah, man, appreciate you bringing me on this podcast.
Thanks so much for coming on. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope our listeners, really take in, our conversation.
No, awesome. So I just want to do a little plug of my podcast of folks who are interested in learning more, and check out Sherjan.com. I have a lot of my podcasts is there, and I put up most of my content is free. So 99% of the content I do is free. And if you're bored of that content, you should so that content is all on my podcast, which is called My Personal Mentor, which you can find on Sherjan.com. If you want more help, go to, there's webinars that I teach from time to time. And if you want even more help, which I hope you don't need, but you should be able to find in the free content, then you can sign me up as a personal mentor. So
awesome.
That's me. And if you want to have any questions, reach out to me on Twitter at Sherjan Husainie.
Awesome. And I'll link all of those things in the description of the episode.
Awesome. Thanks, brother. I appreciate it.
Thanks again.
No worries. Take care.
Art of Impact is co-hosted by myself, Talal and Angad Erneja. Behind production and occasional co-host is Tate Baggett. Our director of marketing is Max Bayevsky, and our music is produced by Pranav Vaidyanathan. Thank you for listening, and see you soon.